Hello and welcome to English Literature with Susan. Here I'm going to talk about the poem Poetry by Marianne Moore. The poem is about the concept of poetry itself. At a time when many poets were experimenting with different forms of poetry, they were experimenting with the material of poetry, the subject matter of poetry. Marianne Moore has written this famous poem. Maybe this is the most anthologized poem by this poet. Marianne Moore as an American poet is like Will Stevens. Will Stevens's world is always a meaningful place, and this is also the case with Marianne Moore. And the reason for Moore's poetry being, meaningful, um, although maybe the world not every time is making sense in the time of modernism, is that she refers to nature. She finds recourse to what is to what is meaningful, nature, the earth, the poetry of the earth. So is written by her, and she doesn't feel lost. She knows her directions. Even at the time, 1919, she has written this famous poem. The poem has its own cadence, its own music, but the paragraphs are running on, so we cannot say that the stanzas are independent in this poem. But before going to read the poem, we need some background information about Marianne Moore herself and her position in the context of poetry. So, where is she located? In contrast with figures such as Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. Let me tell you that she and other female poets at the time were working on a difficult kind of atmosphere because at the time many poets, including Ezra Pound, thought that poetry is a masculine task and that the feminine poets are not capable to come up with the difficulties and the complexities of modern time poetry. This quotation is taken from a letter written by Ezra Pound to Marianne Moore. Marianne Moore had sent one of her poems to Pound, and Pound has replied in this way: "Thank God, even though you're a woman," as if being a woman is something negative. I think you can be trusted not to pour out a flood, and he means it. But to pour out a flood refers to the emotionality in poetry and how female poets imbue and fill poetry with emotions. But Ezra Pound thinks that Marianne Moore is not such a woman, and he's praising and admiring her for that. And in the continuation of the same sentence, the same letter, he says that you pour out a flood like Amy Lowell. So Ezra Pound is the one who defines what is good poetry, what is bad poetry, and he's a reference. He's a leader. He led the little and Marianne Moore both, though they themselves were editors of poems, wrote wrote to him. Marianne Moore was the editor of the famous Dial poetry magazine. So even Marianne Moore thought that maybe Ezra Pound had that kind of charismatic leadership in poetry, and she sent her poetry to him, and this is how he had replied. I don't like this way of replying her. Besides that, he's pushing away or suppressing the voice of female poets other than Marianne Moore, for example, Amy Lowell, but by effeminizing their poetry. But also, he's not even respecting Marianne Moore by calling her, even though you're a woman, as if that being a woman is like a malady or something. By the way, I have put this quotation here to remind you of something. We can let's say divide the female poets of the time into two groups: the ones who didn't care about the leading movements in poetry, and they were not part of that stream, and the ones who wanted to be part of it, like Marianne Moore. Marianne Moore chose to be part of the mainstream of poetry, though that mainstream was a masculine mainstream. So her poetry becomes dry in terms of emotionality. Emotionality is not in there. She writes sometimes a matter of fact kind of poetry. Though we cannot, of course, let's say her poetry doesn't have femininity. Her poetry has those emotions, and that gender consciousness, but maybe she's controlling everything. Or we can say that Marianne Moore is a fighter. She's fighting to find her position, unlike others who choose to isolate. She wants to be part of that stream mainstream of poetry, and don't forget that she's writing at a time that James Joyce had written that after the wasteland, poetry has ended for the ladies because the wasteland didn't included any emotions. The poem was a wasteland of emotions as well. But anyway, she had her own voice, and she is admired for that, not only by male poets but by other female counterparts. What is poetry about? She's writing a poem about poetry, so it seems that she has a say in it. She wants to be part of the definition of poetry at her own time in the 1920s. And what is the poem about, therefore? The poem is about intellect versus imagination. She thinks that poetry needs both of them. Not only imagination is important, but also intellect. The kind of awareness the poet should have, not only of his or her own feelings or imaginations, but also of the knowledge of the technique of poetry. So she thinks that thought, realism, and imagination should be side by side. So the intellect refers to that your capability of living and feeling the real life, and imagination is its opposite. But she thinks poetry should bring a space in which both of these powers, faculties of mind, can have a location. The poem starts like this: I too dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers that there is in it, after all, a place for the genuine. I too dislike it is a quotation. We can ignore it, but when we know that Marianne Moore, as a poet, uses the technique of quotations like T.S. Eliot, quotations from the past, and then she tries to adapt those quotations into the context of her poems. I too dislike it is taken from an interview by Samuel Butler when a young man told him that I dislike poetry. He said, I too dislike it. Here, Marianne Moore starts with this, I too dislike it, and the I is most probably she herself. But she's saying it via a quotation. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. Fiddle, that musical instrument, music, or falsifying image. So poetry is not considered as real, and the realities of life, the facts of life are more important. So it begins like this, but the poem doesn't continue like this. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers that there is in it, after all, even though you don't like it, there is in it, after all, a place for the genuine, the reality. Genuine here refers to what is real, hands that can grasp, and then she brings examples of those genuine moments: hands that can grasp, eyes that can dilate, hair that can rise if it must. These things are important not because and then the first stanza finishes, but in its continuation, the sentence grammatically is incomplete. So poetry can be genuine, can be about real life, high because high sounding interpretation can be put upon them, but because, not because other people would tell us that this poem is important, that this poem is genuine, that this poem has something real in it. No, No, we are not enslaved by the interpretations. We don't trust others. We have to feel them. So a real poem would give it to you without the guidance of the interpreter, the reviewer, the critic. High sounding interpretation can put upon them, but because so we don't look at other people to say to famous critics, for example, what they say about a poem, and then we like or dislike that poem. No, it is not the case, but because they are useful. So poems can also be useful. When and then she stops here, semicolon. She talks about something else. She has an explanation. When they become so derivative as to become unintelligible, the same thing may be said for all of us, that we don't admit what we cannot understand. The problem is that sometimes the poems are so derivative, so unreal, that we cannot understand them, or they use different techniques. They are so mechanical that we cannot get the technique behind them. So if the poem is like that, if the poem brings about a world totally unknown to our own sense of the world, it is difficult to understand it. If it is so, it is derivative. It is not real poetry. So she talks about what is bad poetry, what is and not real poetry, not useful poetry, and the poetry which is useful. And she says not every poem is bad. Okay, and here she continues by talking about subject matters of poetry, and she talks about very ordinary ones that maybe not considered as subject matters for poetry, but they can be. And she wants to say this, that good poets can write about these subject matters in a profound way, while bad and derivative poets cannot do that. So it depends on the poet, whose material, how he or she uses that material. So the poets is like a craftsperson. She or he is giving shape to that subject matter. So you may have the same subject, but a good poet and a bad poet. The bat holding an upside down or in quest of something to eat, elephants pushing, a wild horse taking a row, a tireless wolf under a tree, the immovable critic twinkling his skin like a horse. Oh, okay, she's saying something about the critics as well. The immovable, unlike the dynamism of a poet, the immovable critic twinkling his skin like a horse that feels a flea, and the poem can be a flea, and the twinkling of skin might be the reaction of the critic to say no. This is not a good one. Okay, the baseball fan, and you see here how she has broken the word baseball into two. So the base, that kind of the basic knowledge, the one who is not even a fan of poetry, or some base moments of life, the baseball fan, the statistician, case after case could be cited. Did one wish it? So she says, I can continue this list. Nor is it valid to discriminate against business documents, even business documents, and school books. And she noticed that she is juxtaposing poetry, documents, and books. So all of them, alongside statistics, alongside the baseball match, all of them are important. So she is putting poetry alongside or in the list of the real activities of life. It is so. All these phenomena are important. One must make a distinction, however. When dragged into prominence by half poets, the result is not poetry. So again, it depends on the poet. A good poet can keep and maintain the high position of a poem alongside other subject matters. nor till the autocrats. And when this happens, who are the good poets? The autocrats, the ruler who has absolute power, the autocrats of poetry, nor till the autocrats among us. So we have half poets, and in contrast to them, we have the autocrats of poetry among us, can be literalists of the imagination. I talked about Marianne Moore's interest in using quotations, and this is also a quotation. W.B. Yeats, when he wanted to talk about William Blake, he has called Blake literalists of the imagination, not in a positive way. Um, but here, Marianne Moore is using this quotation as a positive means of representing a good poet. A good poet is like this: literalist, realist of the imagination. So we have that realism, that realist aspect, and the imaginative aspect once again together. Above insolence and triviality, and can present for inspection, if we have that literalist of imagination, the poet can represent imaginary gardens with real thoughts in them. And this is maybe the most famous, most highly quoted and indexed uh, sentence by Marianne Moore, or expression, let's say, by Marianne Moore: imaginary gardens with real thoughts in them. They say that this sentence is very original, but let me tell you that this one is not maybe um, just original. It can be partly a quotation, not a quotation, but an allusion to Paradise Lost by John Milton, where Satan has turned himself into a toad, and he was trying to push Eve into a dream while Eve was asleep. He turned himself into a toad, and then just telling her something, and it was transformed into a dream in Eve's sleep. So imagine gardens can be the Garden of Eden with real thoughts in them, with the real thoughts, with the real Satan in it, with character in it. So a combination again of if we just disregard the Paradise Lost thing, we can say that again, once again, the combination of what is imaginary and what is real. And she thinks the good poets, the autocrats of poetry, can do this. Shall we have it? In the meantime, if you demand on the one hand, and in defiance of their opinion, the raw material of poetry in all its rawness, and that which is on the other hand genuine, then you're interested in poetry. So you have the raw material of poetry, and then what is real, raw material, imagination, and what is real can be combined. This one also, the raw material of poetry, is a quotation. We can again ignore it, but it is interesting that she's quoting from an interview, or an article, if I'm not mistaken, from Samuel Johnson's magazine, the literary magazine, The Spectator. All people to emotions which endure for all time, in which it has been aptly said are the true raw material of poetry. All appeal to emotions. So emotions, imagination, once again. And she's not denying the role of imagination in poetry in a way, or imagination can also be related to emotionality. So she's not rejecting it, but she thinks that this needs a complementary force, that is the genuineness or reality. So this was my reading of this poem, and here you can see this painting which shows the toad in the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve, and that dream maybe in a very kind of apocalyptic postmodernist way. Uh, Thank you very much for listening, and I hope I can see you in my next videos.